So let's get started. I'd like to introduce our dean here at the University of California, Dennis Pendleton.
Thanks so much, Larry. I feel very privileged to be with you this morning to offer a very brief welcome. I'm the non-substantive part of the day's program, but I'm privileged to be here with you because I am truly grateful to each of you for the work that you do every day on behalf of enhancing the well-being of vulnerable children and families. I think it's important work. And I'm also privileged to have the opportunity for us in UC Davis Extension and the Center for Human Services, the Academy and all the units of the center for giving us the opportunity to partner with you in this work. I know that people from my colleagues from the from the center, and I suspect all of you are really excited about having with us Fred Wolshin today, who's a nationally and internationally acknowledged and recognized and award-winning person who works in this field. And my sense is that the essence of his work is about looking at outcomes assessments and how to use data effectively and how to learn from what we're doing to improve policy and practice. And I think that's at the heart of what this day is about. And it's also about creating an opportunity to not only listen to people who bring ideas from other places and who have done really terrific work, but also to the kind of network that it enhances among all of you for exchange of what you're doing in your home operation. And my sense about a day like this is that one of the values is not only the substance of the program, but the opportunity to network, and we're glad to have that opportunity to help provide that opportunity for you. So thank you all again for the opportunity to partner with you, and I wish you the very best for a productive day.
Thank you, Dennis. And you'll see on your schedule that Greg Rose was scheduled to speak today, but he had a conflict at the last minute. But fortunately, both Barbara Eaton and Deborah Williams are here with us, and we're pleased because both of them are such great partners to the University of California and to the counties. And Barbara Eaton has graciously said that she would give us some remarks from CDSS. Barbara?
As Larry said, Greg could not be here today. He had another engagement. He's in San Diego speaking at this moment, and he has a busy schedule. He hasn't figured out how to be in two places at the same time. So he asked me as a branch chief working for him to speak to you briefly this morning. I am over the audits and rates branch, and we actually work closely on these fiscal forums and the fiscal academy, so we hope you enjoy those today. I think that we have an informative meeting, interesting speakers. I've heard Fred speak and Jerry Friedman also in the past, and it's always very interesting information and thoughtful. You take away from it information to think about in the future. Before we get to that part of the agenda, I just wanted to take a few minutes to talk about a few items that are coming up in the future. Our fiscal situation is very difficult, but we have a few projects that we're working on that I thought just mention to you. And that is, we're looking very closely at the Fostering Connections to Success and Increasing Adoptions Act, the new federal law. We're looking at it in terms of maximizing 4E dollars for us. There is an opportunity to get federal funds for kinship, guardianship placements. It looks like they're saying prospectively, and we are arguing that we should be able to include our 14,000 kin guardian kids retrospectively. We don't have a final word on that argument. There's a number of states that are in that discussion. There's also an opportunity to look at extending foster care, and we're looking at the possibility that's a voluntary option on the state's part, and of course that will cost money. We are also looking at training dollars for 4E. They're allowing for 4E dollars to be used to train a larger pool of people. So now we can include court personnel, CASAs, private child welfare agencies, et cetera. And we have had a lot of interest expressed by the private not-profit sector that runs group homes and FFAs around the idea that they could partner with us in training. The other project that we're working on is the residentially based services project, and I just mention that because We have been working with a number of counties and private agencies on really trying to pilot a different approach to group home care. It's AB 1453, and there was an opportunity for any county to participate or attempt to participate. And we have about 4 pilots right now. We've got 2 projects that we're looking at. We haven't approved them yet, but we're hopeful that we'll get something going there. It would be shorter group home stays for kids in more intensive work with families and more community-based types of approaches. So you can look for something coming out of it in the future. The idea was that we would be informed by these pilots and we would be looking at changing the way we do group home care sometime in the future. The other 2 items I just wanted to briefly mention is that we're going to go through a federal 4E waiver in September of '09, and we've had a couple of trainings out there for county staff around that upcoming project. It's important. We've passed the last 2 reviews. This review will occur in San Diego. That will be the site, but we will be pulling cases from all over the state. And as a small to medium county, you may find you're going to have a case in this review and you've never had before. The reason for that is our 4E waiver counties, Los Angeles and Alameda, don't participate in this waiver, so we will not be pulling cases from them, and they have 45% of our cases. So if you have any questions about that, call us and we will be happy to share the information we have, and we have some training that we can share with you too. The last item I wanted to just briefly mention is that we've been working on an overpayments regulation package, and we've been working closely with CWDA in a number of counties. Foster care overpayments has been an issue between us and the federal government the past year or 2. We were paying them back when we collected on overpayments, but they told us we have to pay them back when we identify the overpayment and after the appeal process has happened. And unfortunately, we don't actually collect a lot back. So we've had to actually pay back the federal government, I think to date, over $12 million in foster care overpayments. So a regulation package was required, and we are in the process of putting that through. It's an emergency package, and we hope for you to see it in July of this year. It will indicate how and what process you would use for collecting overpayments. It takes into consideration BAS cases, but I think you will find it will help with some of the overpayment barriers that we've had in the past, and we still have to do more work in that area. And that's it, and I hope that you will come and say hello to us. I'm sitting at the back table in front of the cameras with a couple of my staff, but we'll come around and be happy to meet you. It's nice to put a face to a name with people we work out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Barbara. We'll jump right into the program. I'd like to introduce Fred Wolshin, and as with all of our speakers today, the bios are in your package, and you can see the extensive bio and the work that he's done. We appreciate him. We appreciate him being here with us today. Would you welcome him, Fred Wolshin?
So I'm delighted to be here. I hope we can all say that after 3 hours. It's a long time for you to tolerate me, so I appreciate in advance your forbearance. And let me thank the crew here at UC Davis for the invitation. I've had a conversation, opportunity to have conversations over the years with various colleagues here, and they've always been very stimulating. And I'm happy that I finally get a chance to put faces and names together in a way that I hadn't previously. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I'm particularly delighted to be here on the same day that Jerry Friedman is going to be speaking with you as well. Jerry is a member of our board. More importantly, he has been very instrumental in helping Chapin Hall and the American Public Human Services Association form a partnership that we call the Center for State Foster Care and Adoption Data. It's akin to the arrangement that you have here in California with Barbara Needell on the use of data. It's a way to sort of take that basic set of ideas and explore them across the country by having states send us their data and We use it for a variety of purposes, but first and foremost, it's about increasing the capacity of state public child welfare agencies to both manage, but more importantly, use the administrative data that they spend literally tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars developing, and it's a shame to let that information, that data, not be used to its fullest extent. And I would have to say that despite the efforts of Barbara, the efforts of our organization, the efforts of organizations like ours, despite your efforts at the counties and within the state, despite those efforts to use that information, we have yet to really crack open what those data sources can tell us about the work that we're doing. So we're excited about the opportunity to work with APHSA and directly with state public child welfare agencies, local child welfare agencies, in pursuit of more effective use of data, information, and knowledge in pursuit of our common objectives. I see a couple of familiar faces. Adam, you're sitting over there. Nice of you to sit so close to the front of the room after having spent a week with us last week. I guess it wasn't too bad. We were here last week in California. Chapin Hall was working with various and sundry county analysts, trying to get them to be exposed to the latest work in the field around the issue of outcomes. And we spent actually quite a bit of time talking about the money because that's an important feature of the work that we do. And I think ultimately we have not spent as much time as program people figuring out the financial implications of the decisions that we make, programmatically speaking. And by the same token, fiscal directors have not spent as much time thinking about the programmatic aspects of the decisions they're making. And so it's really and today will be a conversation about merging those two ideas. Obviously, in a time of scarcity, it's important. It's equally important when resources are flowing freely, if in fact ever such a day has happened in the past or might happen again in the future. The idea is we always have to be careful stewards of our money, and I think we want to talk about that today in some detail. When I agreed to do this, I thought we were going to have maybe a 45-minute plenary and then a half an hour or an hour or two workshop, and I see we've rolled those two concepts into one. So we're going to get into some fair amount of details. This is not going to be your typical plenary speech where somebody comes and talks to you about sort of platitudes and whatnot. There's work to be done around this issue of linking outcomes to finance. It's a serious part of the work that we have to take responsibility for, and so we're gonna roll our sleeves up to a certain extent. We won't have the opportunity to spend a week like we did last week, but we'll get into some fairly serious thinking and working. Stylistically, I'd like this to be a conversation. It's a big room and there's a lot of people, but you'll inevitably you'll have questions about the stuff that I'm talking about, and you'll want to have those questions answered. So I invite you to stop me at any time and say, I don't understand what you just said. I don't believe what you just said. Whatever reaction you have to what I'm offering up here, I would encourage you to raise those questions, because it's only through the dialogue that A, the time will pass quickly, but more importantly, that the time will be well spent. You obviously have day-to-day work that you do. You've put that aside to be here for the day, and I'd like to be as responsive as I possibly can to concerns that you have in regards to questions that you may have brought with you from your day-to-day work. So it will be hopefully a dynamic session. I'd like to start off, though, with a show of hands. How many people here are from the budget office? And how many people here are from program or policy? And how many people are here from places that I didn't already mention, whatever that might be? And so let me see those hands again, because some of those faces I recognize. So you're not necessarily directly involved in the delivery of child welfare services, but it's sort of more in the sort of infrastructure of the system. But you're not as close to the front line as the finance people. How many people from the program side have regular conversations with their fiscal people? That's fewer hands than the number of hands who said they were in a programmatic slot. How many people from the program office have active conversations with their program people, fiscal to program? Well, that's even fewer hands. And how many of those conversations between fiscal and program happen before or after the decisions have already been made? Nobody wants to admit to that. Well, I'm of a mind. I'm a program person who got involved in the money in a sort of a backhanded way. In New York State in the late 1980s, early 1990s, there was this little thing called the crack cocaine epidemic. And we let in, we had a child welfare system of about 27,000 kids statewide. It went up to 65,000 kids in 3 years. Much of that was on the increased rate of admission of babies. We went from about 1,200 admissions of babies per year to about 5,000. Extraordinary change in the utilization of foster care, because those babies, as you may well know, tend to stay a lot longer because they have a much higher probability of adoption than do kids of other ages. So we sort of had a double whammy. We brought in more kids who tend to stay longer, so discharge processes started to slow down. And I was a research analyst for the New York State Department of Social Services at the time, and I got called into the deputy commissioner's office at the top of the building. They were on the top floor. I worked in a program division, and he asked me, quite literally, what is it that you do? And I explained to him that I analyze data and I do research and this, that, and the other thing. He said, well, we're running a budget deficit, and it's nice that you have time to do that research, but unless you can actually show us what to do with that research, we really can't afford to have you around, because we can use those resources for other things. So he says, you better come up with something we can use. And I took that as the threat it was meant to be, and started to involve ourselves in understanding where was the state of New York going to be in 5 years if the one thing we knew it could do well were to play itself out, and that was do nothing. We knew that the system would go through the process of trying to make changes and would talk about change, but at the end of the day, rates of admission in terms of what the state was able to control, lengths of stay in terms of what the state was able to control, they were fully capable of just allowing history to repeat itself. So what happens if we really actively engage the process of changing what would happen versus if we did nothing? What would the future look like? And we quickly came to realize that the system had a vested interest in not really getting smaller once it had grown to that size. New York State, and in particular New York City, was a situation where large numbers of voluntary agencies were asked to grow quite substantially to basically absorb that huge admission spike that occurred from roughly 1986 to 1989. Those babies had to go someplace. You may recall, and you may have experienced something similar here in California. We had a border baby crisis where quite literally the babies were sleeping in desk drawers in offices throughout New York City because there was no place to put them in a timely fashion. That the supply of homes, again, just a little more historical background, the population of kids in foster care had been shrinking from the late 80s to the mid 80s, the late 70s to the mid 80s. So the system was in the process of shedding its capacity. And then all of a sudden, literally overnight, it needs to turn that around and start adding capacity. And the kids were coming in and there were no beds, and so they had to increase the capacity. So at the end of the day, the voluntary agencies, what we call the voluntary agencies in New York, were asked to increase their capacity, to recruit homes in neighborhoods and make places for kids. But the fiscal dynamics of the system are such that once you make that commitment to be bigger, there's very little incentive to get smaller, to sort of manage the system back to its size in in a way that is fiscally responsible from the perspective of the public and private partnership that exists when you contract out. Why was that, and why would that still be true today, is largely because it's a fee-for-service system. And one of the things that we quickly realized that for every 1,000 kids in foster care over a 3-year period, we were committed to spending $35 million per 1,000. And there were 65,000 of those kids. And at the end of that 3-year period, only about half of them would be out of care. So we were looking at substantial future investments if the system continued to just chug along as we knew it was fully capable of doing. And the question then became, well, how do we create an environment where it's a good business decision to shrink the system, to become more efficient, not to shrink the system because we want to shrink the system, because admissions had already started going down. By 1989, the number of kids coming into the system was going down, but the caseload was continuing to grow. Why was it continuing to grow? Because kids were staying in care longer at that point in time, because there was no capacity at the back door to move kids along, and frankly, no incentive to do so, because a foster boarding home that commits over the long term to having 800 kids in its census makes certain business decisions about hiring, office space. It enters into contracts for office space to manage all those employees. It develops the infrastructure. It's hard to expand and contract. And if the fiscal system creates tension within the system around that objective, you're going to have problems managing the system in the direction it's inclined to go, given the fact that by now the number of kids coming into the system was already going down. All of which is to say, one of the things that we talked about was ending the per diem system for foster care in the city of New York by engaging what you might fondly recognize as the Title IV waiver. We were the first jurisdiction to propose a Title IV waiver, so far out in front of the curve that there was no federal capacity to grant a Title IV waiver. So we convinced the Congress that the state of New York should be granted a waiver. In his last act as a president who lost the election, as his first act as a president who lost the election, the first Bush vetoed a piece of urban aid legislation that had our Title IV waiver in it. All of which is to say that's how I got involved in the issue of money and child welfare outcomes. And it continues to be what I think is the single most vexing problem in the child welfare system today. That if we don't figure out how to manage the money in relationship to outcomes, I think all of the conversation that you're having about SDM, concurrent planning, community-based services, all of the stuff that we would pack under good old-fashioned child welfare reform is essentially effort that is, the success around that effort is largely constrained by the fact that we operate in a fiscal environment that simply isn't interested in the system getting better. At the time that Nick Scopetta took over the New York child welfare system, he hired a consultant, and he would have Monday night meetings off the record meetings with the various constituencies that make up the child welfare system. And on the way out of one of those meetings, and I don't mean to cast pejoratives because it's an interesting situation, but his response to the dialogue that he was hearing from the assembled constituents, his response was, "I have never seen a system where everybody is so invested in having it be exactly the way it is, despite all of the energy in conversations about change." And that was largely due to the fact that the system is driven by the way the money flows. And again, if you want to break that cycle, we got to change the way the money flows. We're not talking about eligibility. We're not talking about federal match. We're not talking about federal, state, and local share. All of those things are important. What we're talking about is the relationship between outcomes and money. We're not talking about the services that are going to be covered. We're not going to talk about the population that's going to be covered. Those are traditional insurance questions. And you have to think about this child welfare system as an insurance system. We're not going to talk about those classic insurance questions. When people talk about fiscal reform, what they want to do is they want to expand the covered population. We want to make currently non-4E eligible clients eligible for some bundle of 4E services. Kinship guardianship, for example, is about expanding the covered population. Increasing the claimability of preventive services, community and family-based services, is about expanding the covered services component of the insurance policy. Those are all important components of the fiscal conversation. But they are not about the fundamental question, which is how we pay. What's the nature of the contractual relationship that starts off the way in which the money starts to flow from the federal government to the state government, from the state government to the county, and in the event that the county is contracting with or the state is contracting with voluntary or private entities or privatized situation, the way in which that contractual arrangement is managed. And the fundamental question is the nature of how we purchase services aligned with the fundamental problem of, are we buying outcomes or are we buying inputs and process without regard for their relative effect on child welfare outcomes? The bottom line is, it's a system that willingly pays for inefficiency. And when you try to become more efficient, you do so at your financial peril unless you have mechanisms designed to prevent that from happening. And so we have to become much more intentional about that. And my conversation with you today is largely about how to become much more intentional about that, so that in effect the conversation between program people and fiscal people is not one that happens occasionally during the budget cycle when everybody has to prepare their budget materials for presentation to either the legislative briefing or the governor's budget office, wherever the process may fall. You need to have year-round conversations about investments that you're making in children and families, not expenditures that you're logging against your budget projections. So that's going to be the nature of our conversation this morning. Any questions so far? How are we doing? We doing all right? Make sense to you? Did anything I have to say at all resonate in any way, shape, or form? Does it make sense that we have a budget and a fiscal problem in the system in terms of your experience? This is the place where I'd like to see some heads nodding for affirmation, so that I know that I'm connecting at least somewhat with my audience. Very good, thank you for that. Whether it's true or not, I appreciate it. Let me just say a little bit, and Jerry's going to say more about this afternoon if I understand the nature of his remarks. So I'm not going to talk specifically about fiscal issues, but I am going to try and put this into context, because I think there's an opportunity to move things in the right direction at the federal level. And I think to a very large extent, this is the place where a large amount of the energy around fiscal reform is tied up. And it's tied up around the fact that the federal Title IV-E program is perceived as an entitlement. Keyword there, perceived, because I think there are some realities there that people ought to be aware of. But it is, in a sense, the way in which the fiscal dynamics are set up. Because the federal government largely runs a per diem system, it's easy for state and local government to sort of fall in line with the way the federal government is doing things, because it's more complicated to keep two separate systems alive, one for purposes of dealing with the federal government and another one for purposes of dealing with state and local financial situations. So once the federal government sets off its frame of reference, then everything sort of falls in lockstep. And one of the things later on that we can talk about is whether or not that's a requirement on the state and local level. And I think there are ways to think about whether or not state and local government needs to be locked in to the federal financial scheme think there's reason to believe that that's not the case, and I think there are some examples of jurisdictions around the country that, absent a 4E waiver, they are nevertheless engaged in reinvestment schemes. But the federal government really is the place where the action is set, and it centers around this entitlement concept, and it's settled around the idea that we don't want to give up the entitlement. And I think that that's right. We don't want to give up the entitlement. The problem is that creates certain problems that we'd like to get rid of. And if you don't give up the entitlement, then, or if you don't figure out how to manage the entitlement, you sort of wall off your ability to manage some of the other problems. How many people use the term silo or have heard the term silo in their daily conversations around child welfare services? And the problem is we have too many or too few silos? Too many silos. And what is a silo? It's a bucket of money, to mix metaphors. It's a bucket of money that says you can take money out of this bucket for certain services, but no others. Regardless of whether the client you are working with needs those services or not, if that's the available bucket, you got to figure out how to match the child to the bucket of money you have. And there are multiple of these buckets, and the problem is they don't necessarily fit neatly with the category of human problems that we're dealing with. And so you run into the problem of flexibility. You'd like to be able to spend money in different ways. That's what it means to break down the silos, is to match the money you can spend with the needs of the clients that you're working with right here and now. So they talk about flexibility as something that we want to try and get rid of, or we want to try and increase. And I think that to a certain extent in the federal context, that's really not the right conversation to be having, because it misses the point as to why we have silos. And if we're going to get rid of silos, we have to understand why they're there and inoculate the system from the problems the silos are designed to remedy. So what is the issue around this, the silo, and how does it relate to the entitlement concept? What's the nice feature about the entitlement concept? You can claim as much money as you need to, right? There's no limit, there's no ceiling. As much as you need, you can claim. Is that the bottom line as you understand the entitlement construct? That's why everybody was petrified of the TANF block grant, is because it ended the entitlement. It meant that the states could not go back to the federal government if and when they needed to claim more federal money to help meet local expenses. No ceiling on what you can claim from the federal government. They are your full partner in financing the foster care system. That is an excellent position to be in from a risk-sharing perspective. That means my partner is going to be with me no matter what. No matter why I need more money, the federal government is going to be there for me. If I have emergencies, the federal government is there, as well as it should be. But if I have a system that's inefficient, the federal government will also be there for me. And from the federal perspective, that's not really a very good deal. That's not a good risk-sharing arrangement, particularly when it's open-ended. As many claims as you send in, I can't turn them away unless I can demonstrate that it's for a child that is not eligible and for a service that's not eligible. Those are two words for silos. It's not cost reimbursable, and the child is not eligible. How many of you spend resources in your county determining cost reimbursability and eligibility of children? I heard that there's going to be a Title IV review in September. What is the review about? Determining whether or not federal funds were spent on services and children who are not eligible. Why are they doing that? Because it's the only way they have to manage their risk. What's the result of that kind of risk protection? It's that you create silos. You say, I'm going to deny that claim. Why? Under what basis am I going to deny the claim? It was for an ineligible child. I'm going to deny that claim because it was for a service that's not eligible. If you can send me any claim you want, I need a way as the federal government to say, I'm not paying that one. So out of that entitlement system, we create a risk-sharing scheme that forces the creation of silos. So the burden of the risk-sharing scheme right now is largely, although not exclusively, in the hands of the federal government. You resist the silos, you want flexibility. The tension is, in exchange for flexibility, are you prepared to take on more risk? Because that's really the exchange. Who doesn't want to live in a system where you can send any claim for any child and not worry about whether or not the federal government kicks that back to you? Anybody think that the federal government's going to do that anytime soon? How many of you have contracts with provider agencies? Are your counties going to enter into that kind of a contractual relationship? Listen, don't bother with the eligibility of the child or the service you gave. Just send us the bill. We're good for it. Any of you as contractors interested in playing in that environment at all? No, of course not. So it should come as no surprise that the federal government's not interested in that either. And so what it's doing is, by creating these eligibility categories, it's managing risk. It's not trying to constrain your flexibility, it's managing their risk. So if we get into this entitlement conversation, we have to be talking about not flexibility, but new risk-sharing arrangements. So how can we accomplish that? That's going to be the challenge going forward. And I think if we can change the terms of the debate in Washington, I think there's a chance that we might see some action on this. So the first step is to recognize that the real issue is risk sharing. That if you're going to get flexibility, state and local government has to be prepared to take on risk. Now, we have to ask ourselves, well, what kind of risks are we prepared to take on? Risk is not an undifferentiated thing. There are different kinds of risks. In a situation where the economy, in the unlikely event that the economy would go south, and unemployment goes up, poverty increases, stress on families increase, child abuse and neglect is likely to go up, and there's going to be a surge in kids coming into the child welfare system by virtue of a change in the basic need profile in communities. That's a risk. That the number of admissions to child welfare, whether you're thinking about the preventive services system or you're thinking about the foster care system, there's a risk that the number of kids coming into the system is going to be a lot higher this year than it is next year. Who's helping you share that risk? It's a good question. Federal government, right now, the federal government would help you share in that risk, and there's no reason to believe that they shouldn't help you manage that risk going forward. But there are other reasons why there are risks in the system. And quite frankly, the risks are that bad decisions are being made about who needs to get into the system. That kids are placed into foster care who don't belong there. And that can happen a lot. It's very hard for an overseer, as in the case of the federal government, or for the state in relationship to the county, or the county in relationship to contract providers, although in that particular situation, it's a little bit different. But it's very hard to manage that if you have no direct authority over the system. It's very hard to manage the decisions that are being made. And if it's happening in large number, that is to say the system is really not managed very well, that's a risk. And the question becomes, as a payer, should I be willing to absorb that risk in the same way that I'm willing to absorb the risk on the need side? Or should I seek a different risk-sharing arrangement? So that's going to be the question, I think, that has to be resolved in the context of going forward on this issue. So how might we think about resolving that? Well, the dirty word in this conversation, or the dirty phrase in this conversation, the politically incorrect phrase in this conversation, is block grant. And why is a block grant a dirty word? Because it's a very lousy risk-sharing arrangement for the recipients of those funds. Because it basically says there's a ceiling above which we will not go as a payer. If we set aside $500,000 for your county and you need $750,000, too bad. You're going to have to figure out how to come up with the $250,000 on your own. Is it any wonder that counties don't like that? It shifts a major amount of risk in the direction of the payee, the provider, the service provider, the county. Is it any wonder they don't like that arrangement? It's as bad a risk-sharing deal from the payer's perspective, from the payee's perspective, as the entitlement is from the payor's perspective. So we need a way to link these two ideas together. That is to take the good part of the entitlement, which says, if need gets out of control, I'm protected for those risks. If I don't need all of the foster care money that I've set aside because I run a tight ship, I don't want to have to give it back. That's the downside of the entitlement. No claim, no money. So we have to preserve what's good about the entitlement and capture what's good about a block grant, and not respond to those terms from an emotional or a political perspective. We have to do it from a pragmatic perspective, where we have to look at the features of each and try and figure out whether or not there are policy solutions that allow us to take the best of both. And I think, again, the issue here is risk sharing and coming up with an advantageous method for risk sharing. So, what might that look like? Well, the big problem with the block grant is that everybody thinks of it as a ceiling. I think if we change the terms of the debate, we don't see it as a ceiling, we see it as the floor. It's the floor below which, and we'll talk about the federal to the state relationship, it's the floor below which federal revenue will not fall, as opposed to the ceiling above which federal participation will not rise. So basically what the federal government is saying is, we are committed to helping the states run a child welfare system, and here's our contribution. And if you don't need all of it for foster care, you get to keep what you don't need and invest in other parts of the system. That would be another word for flexibility. It also preserves the entitlement, because who's entitled to the 4E money? Or who would we like to be entitled to the 4E money? It's actually not the case right now. Everybody thinks that children are entitled to 4E funds. Children are not entitled to 4E funds. States are entitled to claim on behalf of children. The 4E money does not follow the children. That's the big myth behind the Title IV entitlement. It's not about the children. It's about the state's ability to claim. But if we allow the money to follow the child, whether they're in home or not, now we've preserved the sense of entitlement. But in order to treat it as an entitlement, we have to make sure that it's spent on children who would otherwise go into foster care. That is, the money belongs to the kids who would be in foster care. We have to make sure that they are entitled to that expenditure. It would be nice to spend it on kids whose families are facing tough circumstances. We need to figure out how to increase resources for those families. Don't misunderstand me. But if we spend money from the Title IV pot on kids who are in tough circumstances but would not necessarily be engaged in the foster care system, how would we prevent the utilization of foster care? They're not getting the benefit of the dollars. They're not getting benefit of the services. So there's a high likelihood that they're still going to wind up in foster care, in which case we haven't reduced the utilization of foster care at all. We have increased the expenditures on family and community-based services, which again is a good thing, but the Title IV money is entitled, the kids entitled to the Title IV money are foster children. They should be the first and most direct beneficiaries of those funds. So we have to figure out a way to make sure that those kids in the foster care program who are genuinely at risk of foster care are getting the money spent on their behalf first and foremost. And if there's excess at the end of the day, then we can talk about spreading it around other kids. But the idea of the floor basically says that we'll allocate some money, much like we would under the circumstances of a block grant. Here's an allocation. Think of it as a block grant. But not a ceiling, a floor. If we don't need all that money, we get to keep it for those other investments we'd like to make, provided there's a genuine deflection in the utilization of foster care. So that preserves what's good about the block grant. Because the block grant, the idea of a block grant is, everybody loves the TANF block grant, at least they were loving it up until the last couple of years, because there was a tremendous amount of money and much less actual public assistance use. So they weren't drawing down all of that money for public assistance. What was left over could be used to do other things like job training, daycare, all of those things that support the workforce participation of former TANF recipients. You get to spend what you don't need for the core purpose on other things that actually generate the possibility that you won't need, in this case, in our case, foster care. So I get to buy preventive services in the community. I get to buy aftercare service, post-adoptive services. Why? Because they reduce the demand for foster care in my jurisdiction. So I don't need it, but since I've already got the check up front, I get to save it and spend it in other ways. That's the virtue of a block grant. The downside of the block grant is that if demand for foster care, despite your best efforts, goes up, if it's the ceiling, you're not getting any more money. All of those are state and local costs. That's the bad thing about the block grant. So forget it. Treat the overage as part of the entitlement. That if you have claims in excess of the level allocated, claim it as though you were operating under the old terms of the entitlement. So you've got the risk protection on the downside and the protection or the ability to preserve revenue on the plus side when you actually reduce foster care. Now, the problem with that scenario is that we have to differentiate between genuine changes in demand that are a result of good work versus changes in demand that are a result of not so good work, changes in the demand for foster care that are driven by need, as we might be experiencing in places where poverty, et cetera, is rising, unemployment is rising, versus changes in the demand where the demand for foster care is being driven, quite frankly, by less than adequate work. All of which is to say, we got to link the money to the outcomes. We have to know in no uncertain terms, or at least as best we can, how is the money and the outcome related in what I would refer to as a direct and unambiguous way. Right now, how many of you people could do a return on investment that says we spent this much money on preventive services and we got this much of a benefit on the utilization of foster care side? One hand went up. that's not a very good position to be in. Because how many people here are going before their legislative bodies every year asking for preventive service dollars because they'll be able to reduce the demand for foster care? Come on. How many people are going before their legislative bodies saying if we invest in this, that, or the other post-permanency service, we'll be able to reduce the demand for foster care? That's the nature of the business. So we're making the promise. We're putting the promissory notes on the table and saying, if you give us money to do this, we'll save money over here. How many of your budget offices ever asked you to come back and demonstrate that that's what you actually did? Because the budget making process is from year to year. I was always amazed when we would make proposals and then we would come back at the next budget cycle. We would be there with all the fiscal people, all the legal people, program division making its case before the senior leadership of the agency, and nobody would ever say, well, before we get started, last year you came in here with some ideas about this, that, or the other thing, and the positive effect that it was going to have on thus and such. Do you have any information that verifies that any of that happened? That never came across the table. It's what are we going to do this year? Basically, what are we going to do to increase the covered population and increase the covered services? Expand. Fiscal reform has always in this country been about expanding the money we have, not spending the money we have smarter. We talk in those terms, but whether or not we actually ever get there is a secondary question in the minds of most program and fiscal conversations. So my job today is to begin to wean you off of the old way of doing business and on to a way of business which is more responsible from a fiduciary as well as a programmatic perspective. Because it's my belief, as I said at the outset of my opening remarks, that there is no way to get the child welfare system under control without managing the money more effectively. Any questions so far? None. All right. As one of my colleagues would say, you're picking up what I'm putting down? Is that what I'm getting from the response here? All right. So, show me the money. I guess that's a little bit different than the title I originally gave. But the theme and the ideas are basically the same. We could drop the in a time of scarcity. It's always a little useful device to sort of tap into the central anxiety of the time, and scarcity is a central anxiety of the time. Because we heard at the very outset the proclamation that the budget situation was tight, and so the idea that we could link money and outcomes within the same conversation has particular salience in a time of scarcity. So what I'm going to try and do today, and then we'll get into some of what this looks like, because I think the thing and the reason why it has to be a technical conversation is because this is not something you just sort of hear about and you get some ideas and you say, oh, I really liked what he had to say about risk and risk sharing. Yeah, that's really the problem. This is not a conversation about ideas or values, although they're clearly important. This is a conversation about doing. If you're going to link the money to the outcomes, it's about doing that and understanding and taking charge of the process. So we're going to spend some time actually getting inside that, because I want to convey to you the possibilities. This is not just something that somebody off in the corner does. This is something that organizations need to engage, and it's possible to do that. It's possible to do that with, see if I can get this right, CWS CMS. Did I say that right? That's the data? With the data that you have, it is possible to do this at a level of detail and robustness that I suspect most of you would find far off into the future. It's within our power today. So what I'm going to try and do today, how many of you connect Barbara Needell with the term longitudinal data? That actually is a key component here. So the first aspect of this that says, yes, we have a chance of being able to do this is related to the fact that you already have longitudinal data. Without the longitudinal data, it would be impossible to do this. The benefits of this are that you will achieve greater fiscal control and greater programmatic control. Program people will have a clearer understanding of what's going on in their system, and fiscal folks will have a clearer understanding of where the money is going. It is essential for program people and fiscal people to have confidence in each other, to talk the same language and understand their common future. So, greater fiscal control. You will be able to do a return on investment calculation that is far more detailed and accurate than you likely, and again, I realize that there is variation with respect to counties and their ability to go down this road, but you will achieve greater fiscal control, and one of the ways in which that's measured is that you'll actually have an understanding of when the benefits hit the books. One of the big problems in the child welfare system relative to, say, health care is how long children, for example, are in foster care. It's very unlikely that that people using the healthcare system will have a stay in a hospital that branches out over multiple fiscal years. Right now, if you're in the hospital for more than 5 days, that's a rarity and an indication of the seriousness of the underlying medical condition. And if you are in a hospital stay for more than one fiscal year, it's because you went into the hospital on the last day of the fiscal year and were there on the first day of the fiscal year. In child welfare, it's completely an opposite story. You're very likely to be in foster care over multiple fiscal years. In some jurisdictions, that can be 3 or 4 years, or 3 or 4 fiscal years. So that when you talk about reducing length of stay, and the fiscal benefits, and hence the programmatic benefits, are going to be of value to you programmatically, you have to look into the future, 3 years out, 4 years out, to fully evaluate the extent of the savings that you are going to accrue. That's what I mean when I say you'll have a better understanding when the benefits will hit the books. How many people here are primarily interested in prevention? Am I not asking the right questions, or you don't? Yeah. The issue is, so when you talk about prevention, how many people talk about, well, you never see the benefits of prevention. That's the problem with making the prevention case, because you don't have the counterfactual what would have been the case. Well, we have to deal with that question, particularly since the benefits of what you do today in terms of reducing length of stay may not hit the books for 2 fiscal years. Are you prepared to let that money on the table? That is to say, you don't want it back for the stuff you need it for in order to reduce length of stay in the first instance. If you're willing to forego that money down the line, then by all means, don't worry about understanding when the benefits will hit the books. If you are interested in that money, and since that's where most of the money is, you ought to be interested in it, you need to be able to answer the question, when will the benefits hit the books, and how will I know I delivered the benefit? You can't let that to chance. Fiscal folks will not tolerate that, nor should they, because they're in charge of the money. So one of the things that we're going to try and figure out is how to achieve a better understanding of when the money hits the books. So, longitudinal data, it's not just for outcomes anymore. So what is longitudinal data? I assume that since you've heard Barbara talk about longitudinal data, or you've maybe heard me talk about longitudinal data, blah, 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 blah. It's the gold standard when it comes to tracking and monitoring performance. Let me just say that if you are at all interested in monitoring performance, which of course you are, there's just no other way to do it. You have to have the flexibility that longitudinal data gives you. And when you link outcomes to money, you have to have longitudinal data. There's just simply no substitute for it. And it has to capture all of the events that a child undergoes to the extent that you recover all of the events in the child welfare system. So for example, if you take your AFCARS data, and by virtue of the way the AFCARS data is structured, you happen to miss systematically children who got placed into group care. Might that have a problem from a fiscal perspective? If you just systematically were undercounting the utilization of group care because you weren't keeping track of it in the database, that would be a problem. So without longitudinal data that captures, for example, each and every placement, or each and every placement with a particular provider, because if you're operating in a location where the providers have different per diem rates and you don't know the per diem rate for that provider for that period of time, you're now in the realm of estimation, and you're moving the conversation. If you're talking about estimating costs, are you moving closer to a fiscal conversation or further away from the fiscal conversation? Further away. Fiscal conversations are not about estimations because they have to reconcile the budget to the penny. They're not interested in your estimates. They are interested in your precision. You cannot be precise without longitudinal data. There is no substitute. The good news is you've got the longitudinal data. Most importantly, and I've more or less been talking about this, is that it just allows you to do a better job of tracking the fiscal drivers and the outcome drivers. And since that's the marriage that has to occur, we need to be very concerned with our ability to do this in a great deal of detail. Most of the fiscal dynamics in the child welfare system are about managing the foster care system. Be that as it may, in terms of we're oriented towards reducing the utilization of foster care, and that's what our policy and our practice framework is constructed around. The fiscal dynamics of the system are tied to the foster care system for several reasons. Number one, it's in virtually all jurisdictions, it's the big pot of money. Number two, programmatically, despite what we talk about, it's the place where, as people who run the system, we are the least vulnerable. We can place children in foster care and they're safe, relatively speaking. Those false positives, that is, the decision to place a child into foster care who doesn't need to go into foster care if we could provide the family with other services, hence false positive. The cost of false positives in relationship to foster care are relatively low from a media perspective. Again, it's not problem-free. Kids do get abused in foster care, sometimes horribly, and so it's not a neutral activity. But the cost of false positives are generally lower in terms of psychological, public relations, as well as fiscal costs than leaving a child at home and then having that child show up as a fatality. So the foster care has both a particular center of gravity with respect to cost drivers, but also psychological drivers. And we need to manage the foster care system as the sort of center of gravity in the child welfare system, whether or not we would like to think of it that way or not. What's interesting about the child welfare system and the foster care system in particular, but it's generally true for the system as a whole, is that how many people here would argue with the claim that the child welfare system is a complex system? It is complicated. If you just think about a safety assessment and what's required to do a safety assessment. Well, you got to go to the home. How often do you have to go to the home? At least every 30 days. What do you do when you're there? You got to do a risk and safety assessment. Can't just do a risk assessment, can't just do a safety assessment. You got to do a risk and safety assessment. Why are they different? How are they different? What do you have to do? Do you just fill out the form? Do you have to look at the child? Do you have to talk to the child? Do you have to roll up their sleeves? Do you have to examine their scalp? Do you have to look at their torso? Do you have to go and look at the refrigerator? That's all a risk and safety assessment. It's very complicated stuff to get to. It is a complex system in the details. But from a systems perspective, it's actually very simple. Kids come, kids go. All of the energy in the system is wrapped around those two fundamental decisions. Are we going to let them into the system? And if we do, how long are they going to be there? And if we don't let them in the system, what are we going to do to reduce the risk that they're going to have to come back and be reevaluated for admission? And once we let them in, is it okay to send them home? Or is it okay to end decisions or end services? So from a dynamic perspective, it's really a very simple system. When people look at the foster care system and the foster care population and they say, we have too many kids in foster care, we need to do something about that, there are quite literally two things you can do about that. Three things. You can slow the rate of kids going in, you can accelerate the rate of kids going out, or you can do both. That's it. That's what I mean when I say it's a system that is very simple. How you do that is complicated. But if we think about outcomes and the connection to money and what have you, all efforts to manage the system flow through admission and discharge decisions. Again, all the energy in the system. And by that I mean the workers on the ground right now, knocking on a door, doing a CPS investigation. They're happening as we speak. They are making an admission or discharge decision. Where they are in the process will define to a certain extent the exact nature of their encounter today with that family, but they are involved in a process that either lets kids in or it gets kids out. Families in or families out. All of the energy in the system tracks back to that. Prevention, all of the things that we talk about prevention. Structured decision making, what's that about? Making a decision that says, yes, we need to bring the child further into the system. No, we don't need to. Again, how the decision is made, the way the information is collected, how you resource the capacity to do that is complicated, but they are engaged in that prevention decision. In-home community-based services designed to reduce the overall level of stress and tension in communities so that fewer children fall into the risk category, so that fewer children move closer and closer and closer to the system, so as to prevent their admission into the system. Again, think about it in terms of foster care or think about it in terms of community-based services. Are they coming in or are they going out? concurrent planning, aftercare, post-adoption services. I feel more comfortable sending the child home today because I know there are community-based aftercare services available to the family. If those services weren't there, I would delay the decision until the family was able to complete the work they have to do. But with the services there in the community, I can support the family without having the child be in foster care. What does that do? It changes how long the kid stays in foster care. So all of the energy in the system is about controlling exits and entries.